In this lesson, we're going to take a look at what led to the Constitution. First of all, on some of the problems that faced the early Confederation of the United States, and then some of the precedents that occurred that created the Constitution in the first place. But keep in mind that the Congress that existed, that Continental Congress as it was known, had already been successful using the Articles of Confederation as a government. They had been successful in declaring independence from Great Britain. They had been successful in waging and fighting a war against Great Britain. The problem was it wasn't always exactly an easy success. Well, for the most part, it wasn't an easy success at all. Not only that, but they often did not agree on things. But let's take a look at some of the specific issues. The first one was in terms of economic depression. Now, one idea we have to deal with is in our day and age, we often believe that the state has to control the economy or somehow manage the economy or regulate the economy, so that essentially people always have jobs and people always have money. The problem is the state doesn't produce anything or sell anything, and so really the economy is always controlled by private interest. Now, that's not really the road that we're heading down today, but there are economic issues that the state does concern itself with. And one of those economic issues was when you're fighting a war against another nation, in all likelihood, you're not doing business or trading with that nation. And in fact, when the United States fought the war with Great Britain, they no longer traded with Great Britain. The problem with that was that Great Britain was our biggest trading partner at the time. And so when the war shut down trade between the two nations, which really didn't resume until a while after, that meant a huge blow to the livelihoods and the economy of many Americans. And so it was something that the Americans looked to the Congress to resolve. Another issue that's going on at this time is the whole issue of currency, the money supply. See, the Continental Congress, as well as the various states over here in the New World, had produced paper currencies. They had issued their own money. The problem with a lot of this money is it wasn't really tied to any real currency, what we call hard money, which is things like gold or silver or copper. And because it wasn't tied to any real hard money, that meant that its value often went down over time. And in fact, the money supply experienced great inflation, so that if you possessed money that was printed by your state or by the Continental Congress, it often was seen as worthless, and you'd much rather trade with money that was backed by gold or money that actually had gold in it, such as a gold coin. And in fact, many Americans did this. But the problem is that several people, such as the soldiers of the Continental Army, were paid in that worth less money of the Continental Congress. In fact, it was worth about a 40th of the value of gold and silver-backed money. Another issue in terms of the economy was the debt that we had contracted. National debt is actually not anything new to the United States, but the difference between the national debt back then and today's national debt is in terms of amounts, in terms of how much of our livelihood it takes, and also our attitude about it. Still, the fledgling United States faced an incredible debt, a debt back then that was $75 million, which is roughly $1 billion in 2012 dollars. Even so, this debt was crippling to the early republic. Debt is always crippling. You always owe something to someone else. They always expect you to pay that, and as Proverbs say, you are slave to your lender until you pay your debts off. Secondly, the next great problem that you see in the early United States underneath the Articles of Confederation was that the states weren't exactly in harmony with each other. The states had constant disagreements. For example, they didn't always follow the foreign treaties that had been established by Congress, and they would sometimes deal with foreign nations or deal with native tribes, which were seen as foreign nations, on their own, which meant that some states, such as maybe New York or Georgia, could be at war with a foreign power while the other was not, or while the Continental Congress was not. And so this created a confusing foreign policy. It meant the states really didn't necessarily have any control over who did what. Another issue was the states usually didn't obey the laws set forth by the Continental Congress. And that was because the Continental Congress had no way to enforce those laws. Sometimes the states would tax trade in between the states. So if Maryland and Virginia did not like each other, which at various times they did not, they could simply tax the goods that Maryland sent to Virginia, or vice versa. And so the states were not often on great terms with each other. Furthermore, a lot of those debts that had been contracted by the war, several of the states simply refused to pay the debts. And then, when the Continental Congress would meet together to try and declare solutions for these problems, often the states wouldn't even send delegates to the Congress, which meant there were not enough people who showed up to actually have a legal vote. And so it was a huge problem with this disharmony among the states. A third issue that occurred was something known as Shays' Rebellion. This actually happened early in the year 1787. It happened in Massachusetts over a couple of taxes. See, Massachusetts had contracted its own debt from the war. It was one of the largest in all the colonies. And this debt had to be paid down, so they came with a couple of taxes. One was called a poll tax. And the poll tax was where anyone who lived at your home who was 16 and up, you had to pay a yearly tax because that person lived there. It was basically a head tax. Another tax that they came up with was something called a stamp tax, or a stamp act, where any paper goods or legal documents, for example, or things like newspapers had to be printed on paper that essentially had a stamp on it that was approved by the legislature. If I recall, that sounds a little familiar, or like something else we've talked about being done. Maybe you can remember. Even so, several things like this were occurring that tended to rile up the colonists against their own state and begin to think of Massachusetts as behaving in a similar way to Britain. Difference, of course, was Massachusetts actually had an authority to do these things. But another issue that was occurring was that when people had taxes that had to be paid, they had to pay them either using hard currency, gold or silver, or they could use the paper money that wasn't really backed by gold and silver. The problem came when various tax collectors would go to these people who owed money to the state, and they would tell them, oh, you have to pay me in silver or gold. That's the only thing the state will accept. So they essentially were liars. They were essentially committing fraud. Because what they would then do is they would take that gold and silver, and for just a little bit of the gold and silver they collected, they could buy the paper money needed to pay the tax and then pocket the rest. Often these tax collectors would pocket a 75% profit upon common craftsmen and farmers throughout the state of Massachusetts. Eventually, a former captain by the name of Daniel Shays, along with 2,000 other men, decided to rise up and demanded action. And they demanded this action at gunpoint. Now, the rebellion didn't last long. It was actually put down by the old Continental Army. But what this did show was it showed that the states were really struggling in their sovereignty. It showed that they had been united for the War of Independence, but nobody had really addressed the question of how are we to be united afterwards? What exactly does that look like? Now, there are several precedents that happen as well besides these distinct problems. One of those precedents occurred in the year 1781. It was in that year that a young man by the name of Alexander Hamilton wrote a paper in which he argued that a central government with some kind of stable currency was needed. He actually based this upon the writings of Adam Smith, particularly his book, The Wealth of Nations. Well, Alexander Hamilton is an interesting character, and in fact, we're going to take just a moment to discuss him. He himself had been born in the West Indies. His parents were not married, so he kind of grew up with people not looking upon him in a favorable way. But even so, he came from a great Scottish background and from a Huguenot background as well. He was given great teachers who taught him the doctrines of the Reformation while he was growing up. And he also had incredible ambition. In fact, at the age of 12, he became a clerk in which he really learned the arts of business. By the age of 15, he had come over to the colonies, actually had come to New Jersey first, where he spent a lot of time with one of those presidents we talked about, Elias Boudinot. And there, under Boudinot's tutelage, he learned a great deal about how a state like New Jersey worked. He also was encouraged to go to Princeton to really crown his education that he'd already received. He investigated Princeton, but Princeton required 4 years for him to actually achieve his degree. He didn't want to take 4 years to do this. That was too long, too much of his life. And so Hamilton instead went to the King's College, which would eventually become Columbia University, in Manhattan, and there he was allowed to do 4 years worth of work in only 2. It gives you an idea of the ambition and just the wherewithal that Alexander Hamilton had. By the age of 17, having graduated, he was already giving public speeches, writing pamphlets in favor of independence, and eventually he would raise his own artillery company and would eventually become the aide to George Washington and one of the heroes of the War of Independence. As I mentioned to you earlier, it was Hamilton who actually stormed one of the British redoubts during the Battle of Yorktown and successfully captured it, which actually ended the battle and thus ended the entire war. He's known to history, though, as the father of the Constitutional Convention. Now, Madison, of course, is called the father of the Constitution, but Hamilton was the one who got the convention, or the meeting together, to actually create this Constitution. He himself saw the Articles of Confederation, the existing government, as needing a great revisement, of needing some kind of great repair. He himself also was a strong believer in a central government, and things like a central bank or a Supreme Court. One of the interesting things about Hamilton is that Hamilton kind of distrusted the states and really fell more on the camp of Union thinkers. Had the war between the states happened at this time, I imagine Hamilton would have been on the side in many ways of the northern states, but of course that's a bit of a different argument altogether. Another precedent that occurred during this time had to do with all of that land to the west. Those lands, if you remember, that had been secured by the work of George Rogers Clark and the backwoodsmen who accompanied him in his fight against the British at places like Kaskaskia or Vincennes. See, all of this land was now part of United States territory. But the question was, with all the people who wanted to settle it, how do you effectively settle it? What kind of laws and governments are you going to have there? Are they going to be directly ruled by the Constitutional Congress, or the Continental Congress, that is? Or are they going to be ruled by individual states? How do you divvy that up? And so Congress began to sell off lands and began to come up with ways to actually form various states. In fact, by 1787, Congress had written the Northwest Ordinance, which actually gave an entire process for individual states to develop. And places like Ohio or Indiana, for example, would become states under that ordinance. Another precedent occurred earlier in the year 1783. It was in that year when the states of Maryland and Virginia, who had been fighting over how to control trade on places like Chesapeake Bay, agreed to have a convention actually under the guise, or under the watch, I should say, of George Washington. And so it shows you that the states were willing to negotiate. They were willing to meet together and figure out solutions for common problems. Another way that they did this was in the year 1786, was a fourth precedent, in which they met at Annapolis. Problem was, only 5 states actually showed up. But they still determined that at Annapolis they would need a new convention. They would need a new meeting to actually ratify or change those Articles of Confederation and perhaps even make something new, which of course is what they did.